everyone. I'm Tammy Vigil, Senior Associate Dean of Boston University's College of Communication. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to the discussion of climate change, communication, and public relations. Today's event is part of our series of virtual events we call COMtalks, featuring topics and experts in advertising, film, journalism, media science, public relations, and television. Our conversation today will be recorded and available to watch later online on the COM website and YouTube channel. Today's conversation explores the ways the public understands and interprets information surrounding environmental issues, particularly related to climate change. Although there is a great deal of published science and research confirming the causes behind the current climate crisis, many people are unmoved and unconvinced. Mis and disinformation contribute to the sometimes extreme variations in how people understand and respond to climate change. The impact of mis and disinformation leaves us asking questions such as, how does disinformation about the climate crisis spread through social media and deceptive advertising? What influence does it have on public attitudes? And what can be done about it? A panel of Boston University researchers conducted a year-long study on these topics and are here to provide some answers to these and other questions that you might have. Today's panelists are Drs. Amazeen, Krishna, and Wells. Dr. Michelle Amazeen is the inaugural Associate Dean of Research here at COM and an associate professor whose research is located at the intersection of journalism studies, media effects, and political communication. Michelle explores the nature and persuasive effects of misinformation and efforts to correct it. She earned her PhD at Temple University. Dr. Arunima Krishna is an associate professor of public relations at COM. Her research focuses on public's perceptions of controversial social issues, such as anti-vaccine activism, climate change, and workplace gender discrimination. She earned her PhD at Purdue University. Dr. Chris Wells is the interim director of the Emerging Media Studies Division in the College of Communication and an associate professor of journalism and emerging media studies. Chris explores how news media coverage takes shape, how citizens learn about politics, and how they choose to participate. He earned his PhD at the University of Washington. Serving as moderator for today's discussion is Emily Greenhalgh, a marine biologist turned science communicator based in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. She's an alum of COM and graduated in 2012 with a master's degree in science journalism. Her writing beat includes climate, environmental science, and biology. And it's a really big week for Emily because her debut children's book, Fun with Oceans and Seas, was released just yesterday by Penguin Random House. Congratulations, Emily, and welcome back, I should say, to COM. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's event. And right now, I think it's time for me to hand it on over to Emily.
Thank you, Tammy. And thank to those of you who joined us today for this discussion, our great panelists and all of you that are online. Before we dive in, a little note about format is I plan to get the ball rolling with some questions for the panel, but in a little bit, we'll be open to Q&As. We really want to hear from you and kind of to see what you are. So I cannot wait to hear your questions, and we'll get to as many as we can. All right, you ready to dive in? So you three were all involved in a study on climate and public opinion you presented in the spring. But before we get to some of the findings, tell us how it started. It received support from a fund here at BU, but what new ground did you hope to explore when you started?
Sure, I'll grab that one. So thanks, Emily. Yeah, we were actually funded by two institutes on campus. One was the Hariri Institute for Computing, and the other was the Institute for Global Sustainability, which is a unit on campus focused on climate and other aspects of sustainability. So when we saw the call, we were interested in doing something on this project, partly because the call was really interested in folks who could combine some data science with concern about climate and misinformation. And we had kind of all those pieces, many of them in COM, but also some of them with collaborators. So we put together a team that consisted of the three of us from COM, plus Sarah Finney-Robinson, also from COM, and then colleagues in engineering and Metropolitan College. And with that team, we thought we could tackle the problem of climate misinformation from a couple of angles. So we have studied climate misinformation on social media, especially Twitter and Reddit. We've looked at climate disinformation in terms of native advertising from about a couple dozen major news organizations. And we've conducted a survey that looks at citizens' responses to seeing different kinds of misinformation about climate.
Great. All right, for the group, biggest takeaways from that research.
So
Michelle?
I can start on that one. So for me, I think one of the biggest takeaways was that the origins of disinformation on climate, it's not just fossil fuel companies that are spouting this, but so are some of our mainstream legacy news organizations in the United States. They are
Like who? You want to give an example?
Yeah. So the news organizations are creating these messages that are competing with their own climate reporting. So, for instance, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, they all now have these in-house, essentially advertising agencies. They're in-house content studios that create ads on behalf of clients. These aren't the reporters who are making the ads, but it is employees of the news organization, and they are all creating ads for fossil fuel companies. And often what's in these ads competes with what the reporters are saying, and it actually contradicts what the reporters are saying. So
now this is what you refer to as sort of native advertising, right?
Right. So I can show some examples if that would be helpful to the audience. Let me see.
I think absolutely.
Up something here. So I'm going to share my screen. So what I'm showing you here, can everybody see that?
Yes.
So you see the masthead, the New York Times at the top. And then if you scroll down, it looks like an article. But if you look carefully at the top, it does say paid post. And to the left of the screen, it says ExxonMobil. So that's the disclosure that indicates that it's not really a news article. It's sponsored. It's paid. So native advertising is content that appears native to the platform on which it appears. It appears in social media, but it's also what we were looking at is the custom content created by news organizations that mimics their news articles. By law, according to the Federal Trade Commission, they need to disclose that the content is paid for. My past research suggests those disclosures aren't always very easy for individuals to see. Some people don't know what those disclosures mean, and sometimes those disclosures disappear. But we can get into that in a little bit. So that was my big takeaway, is that news organizations are complicit.
It's important to know because that's where I think a lot of us go to get our information. So to know that you have to sort of analyze and look carefully, even when you open up, the New York Times or the Washington Post, it's an important thing to know about how you take in disinformation as well. Arunima, what was your big kind of takeaway from the research?
For me, the big takeaway was the fact that climate misinformation, when we think about climate misinformation, we think, oh, climate change is a hoax. It's not happening, right? We think of that as being the main focus of climate change denialism, or we think of climate misinformation as being climate denialism, whereas it's a lot more sophisticated. And once we understand the huge and very well-funded machinery that is behind these kinds of misinformation attempts, that's when we realize the scale of climate misinformation, all aimed toward possibly reducing support for climate action, which is it's something that we all have to tackle with and understand that that's where it's coming from.
Well, you talk about the big machine that sort of funds climate disinformation. So rolls right into my next question, which is what are the people or institutions that are sort of behind this mis and disinformation that's shaping how we consume media about climate?
So this is it's a multifaceted problem. today we have a very politically divided public opinion on this issue. It wasn't always this way. Things were pretty different up until about 20 or 25 years ago. But today it's strongly divided, so that Republicans and Democrats have just totally different views of climate, and the trail of misinformation follows in the wake. But following on what Michelle said, for much longer than that, before that, the fossil fuel industry and related foundations that it funds had been spreading lies and sort of false uncertainty about climate for decades before that. And ExxonMobil is certainly the worst offender, but by no means the only one that's been involved. So Naomi Oreskes and her colleague, Greg Supran, have documented a lot of this in their book, in Merchants of Doubt, and other places. It's well documented, but new findings are still coming out. The Wall Street Journal just published a piece last week revealing more about how much Exxon knew while they were misleading the public about the dangers of their products. It's really interesting when you look at social media. Our team from Metropolitan College who looked at social media, when they looked at the social media profiles of fossil fuel companies themselves, like BP and Exxon and others, there was very little in terms of contesting climate itself. So in terms of Twitter, for example, Exxon is not saying climate change isn't happening or anything like that. However, once they started looking at the various foundations that Exxon is affiliated with and that Exxon funds, right there on Twitter, it's quite clear that those narratives are still being really strongly promoted. One other thing I'll say is that some of those narratives have moved on from climate change isn't happening or we're not sure it's happening, which were very prominent discourses 20 years ago.
Right.
But now they've moved on predominantly to the fossil fuel companies are transitioning. We are shifting into to green energy, which they are, but at such a tiny scale that it's almost misinformation just to mention it. So their strategy now is to delay as much as possible the rollout of policies that would prevent them from essentially burning the carbon products that they already have access to.
Right. And to follow up on that, the example that I just shared of the native ad in the New York Times from ExxonMobil, it was touting their biofuels made with algae in that particular example.
Mhm.
What they didn't say was that it represented 0.00001% of what they're doing. And in the meantime, they're actually increasing their fossil fuel production. And so that particular native ad that I showed, it is actually an exhibit in a lawsuit that now Governor Maura Healey, when she was Attorney General of Massachusetts,
Mhm.
has sued ExxonMobil, and that ad is one of the exhibits in the lawsuit as misleading to consumers. There's other
Interesting.
states, there's other states that have sued
Yeah.
the fossil fuel industry. Most recently, California.
Sorry, I couldn't tell if Arunima was about to say something. I saw you move, and that's all really fascinating too, because I would assume, just as somebody who sort of, is active on social media and not even, with my journalism hat on, just as somebody who's kind of on there, that you'd expect these fossil fuel companies to be like, oh no, the problem's not that bad. But the fact that it's being kind of routed with these foundations whose goal is misinformation almost gives it this, thin veneer of respectability on either side. Like it's its own type of denialism. Because if a person looked and they were like, oh, well, sure, ExxonMobil wants you to keep drilling, but no, this unrelated foundation, unless you pull up I-9s and see where everything comes from. All right. So clearly there's big picture engines. People would like to keep drilling, important money that kind of drives a lot of the disinformation that's happened over the course of decades. But what about individuals who have, it's a little bit partisan, obviously, but people who have decided that what they're doing is going on to every post about climate change and, New York Climate Week is happening right now and being like, you're all alarmist, the sky is falling, it's global cooling. These people who are posting on social platforms like Reddit or X, Twitter, how is it possible to attack that, to challenge those perceptions, or to kind of, challenge anything that is just that decentralized?
I can take that one. So a couple of years ago, I developed this typology, which is the typology of disinformation susceptible publics, which essentially is a way to identify from the broader population 4 distinct groups who are susceptible to misinformation about a specific topic. And I tested that typology on climate change, in fact. And so the central idea is that people who are motivated about a topic, who have extreme attitudes about a topic, and have previously accepted misinformation about a topic, are most likely to be amplifiers of misinformation. So not only are they going to accept misinformation in the future, they are the ones who are likely to be going to those posts and saying the climate is cooling. So I call them misinformation amplifiers. What we don't realize, so the typology is misinformation immune on one end and misinformation amplifiers on the other. And in the middle is where the vast majority of us live, where we are misinformation vulnerable or receptive. And so what we don't realize is that the misinformation amplifiers have an outsized voice in the debate on any topic that they're motivated about. So if you think about anti-vax debates, same thing. It's a small minority that has a loud voice and is not afraid to use their platform to amplify their voices and to amplify the misinformation about the topic for which they are so highly motivated. And so the first step to sort of addressing the problem is understanding whom to target. And so I argue in my research that the amplifiers, not just because they're so small, but because they're so highly motivated, any efforts to try to change their minds are probably not going to be super effective because their views are so entrenched. And this has borne out study after study that I've seen. And in the data that we've collected, Michelle and I have a program of research that has examined this phenomenon. And so we've seen time and time again that those who are on the very extreme, trying to target them is pointless because any intervention that we design falls on deaf ears or doesn't really work. And so that's something that policymakers, that climate communicators, science communicators need to understand, that you will always have that fringe. And so it's a matter of sort of trying to block that noise out and trying to see how we can reach that middle that is trying to find information or is apathetic to the information. And so how do we get them motivated enough to not only pay attention to the information we're providing, but also engage with it and change their minds accordingly. And then on the other end are the misinformation immune, where when I say this, I'm sure this will strike you, there's a lot of exhaustion among those of us who are truly caring about the planet, who truly want to do something about it, but those voices are loud, they are not scared, they often hide behind fake names. And so it's very difficult for those of us who want to do something about it to actually go out and engage with them. So that's sort of where my research has taken me so far.
It's interesting because what's that phrase, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So it's not that is the majority of people, it's just they're shouting the loudest and are kind of hard to ignore.
And if I could add on
absolutely.
Just a little bit, it would seem to me that those amplifiers, it seems like the platforms are actually enabling them because in our commercialized media system, what gets attention is what gets rewarded. And if you are sensational and loud and attract attention, that's going to get amplified on social media.
Absolutely. And even not just getting attention, but like any sort of engagement, there's the hate retweet or what have you, where you're engaging with it because you're so annoyed, but now that still shows the original message back to more people. And that's that's a hard thing unless you're sitting there and sort of adding your own context of like, here is why this is false for every single post. So, from my perspective on the non-research side, and, Chris, you mentioned this too, that I think partisan now more than ever is really influencing the popular opinion on climate. Can we do anything to sort of shift with more facts or, more evidence showing these people, Arunima, you said it doesn't work for these people that are sort of the misinformation amplifiers, but what about the other people? The people who, the news has always told them, the news that they focus on has always told them that climate change is being blown out of proportion. Is there any facts, evidence we can give these people that sort of bring them more to the centrist view on climate change?
Yeah, I think that looking at it in terms of facts and evidence is going to be very challenging, partly because people don't respond to facts, but they respond to stories. So I think that some of the most interesting work and efforts in this area aren't around barraging people with more facts or trying to get people's facts straight, but it's trying to give them stories that have angles that they can see themselves in and concerns that they have. So a couple examples would be the work that groups like Trout Unlimited and Ducks Unlimited are doing, which brings the issue of climate and the fact that seasons are changing, migrations for both birds and fish are changing, and this is disrupting traditional lifestyles in terms of hunting and fishing. I think that makes sense to people, and it can bring the issue to the level that has a visceral personal reaction in terms of the place where I have fished with my grandfather for so many years is suddenly changing, and kind of what can we do about this problem? I think that can give people who are more of a sort of traditional red state kind of situation a way to see into it. And then there's been a fair amount of discussion about the Inflation Reduction Act, Biden's bill, which of course is actually primarily a climate bill, and the fact that it has targeted and created incentives that will create a lot of industry in red states, in places that have a lot of sun, have a lot of wind, and have the capacity to build new battery plants like rural Georgia, for example. And so there's also increasingly going to be an economic incentive for people to perhaps see the issue of climate differently. That's certainly not a sure thing, but I think those efforts to change the story that people tell about climate, as opposed to it being a Democrat versus Republican thing, or we have the facts and whatever you think is somehow distorted, maybe those ideas have more potential.
I think that's really smart. It's, especially unfortunately as climate impacts kind of are growing, and I think the important thing too is to avoid for so many years we're like, well, there was a snowstorm, and then people said there's no climate change, and you had to be like, well, weather isn't climate. And now it feels almost like we're walking it back, because we're like, well, yes, no, weather, an individual weather event is not indicative of climate change, but now we've had 10 years of abnormal weather. That is climate change. But it's still meeting people where they are. The warming weather is bringing tick populations north. So everybody I've talked to is afraid of the Lone Star tick because they want to keep eating red meat and, are scared. Tick-borne illnesses are scary. But I think that meeting people where they are and not coming as I am smarter than you makes a lot of sense, with kind of bringing people more to your view.
You also raise, if I could interrupt, you also raised
absolutely.
That this is just going to hit people, individual and states' pocketbooks incredibly hard, increasingly. We've got insurance companies pulling out of the state of Florida because they simply can't afford to insure people's houses at anything like an affordable level. So it's going to, unfortunately, at this point, because of course, whatever we've already put into the atmosphere, even if we turned off the spigot now, the effects of climate change will still increase for several decades. But people will increasingly find that they can't afford to live where they want to live or where they've traditionally lived, and that it's simply because it's unaffordable to keep rebuilding houses that get flooded all the time.
If I
If
may
I-
just also plug the work of one of our colleagues,
Yeah.
David Abel from the Boston, formerly of the Boston Globe, now professor of the practice of journalism. He just has a documentary coming out called Inundation District on the
Mhm.
seaport. So again, on the potential effects of climate change on the multi-billion-dollar investment that the city of Boston has done in the seaport. So if you're interested in that, I would definitely watch that work. But sorry, Michelle, I interrupted you.
No. That's very important what you were sharing. And I wanted to add that the fossil fuel industry has been using this sort of strategy in their messaging, telling these stories, these narratives.
Yeah.
We found some great examples in our native advertising repository of stories that were in the Atlantic monthly magazine, sponsored by Chevron. That always wasn't clear that it was sponsored by Chevron, but just telling these stories about what's happening in Middle America and, you know, how we still need the fossil fuel industry and all the economic benefits that it's bringing to these remote areas, how it's helped educating the children. Fracking has brought a lot of funding into the areas and jobs and is helping to build communities. What it doesn't say is what happens later to the environment after the resources are extracted from the earth. But nonetheless, these are very persuasive stories that are being used. So I think Chris and Arunima are right on that we need to be using those same types of strategies.
I think that's really important. And I think too that people, for example, you know, Chris, you talk about how people are not going to be able to live where they want to live as climate impacts continue. And yet it almost seems that the people who are responsible for building developments are sort of ignoring that. Like, how many new housing is being built in Phoenix, Arizona, which, you know, had the hottest summer it's ever had and relies on, you know, the Colorado River, which so does the entire southwest of America. And it's one of those things where how do you fight climate misinformation or disinformation rather, when people can walk down the street in the place they've always lived and be like, well, they're building new houses. They wouldn't invest in this if it wasn't going to be safe to live here in 20 years.
Well, and that's what David Abel's film is about, isn't it, Arunima? What was it called?
Inundation District.
Inundation District. I mean, it's about the seaport.
Yeah, I'll have to check it out.
I think part
yeah.
of it is also just there isn't regulation in most states that requires builders to consider the effects of climate change in the future.
Mhm.
And I don't know what that would look like. That is not my area of expertise by a long shot. But builders are going to build so they can sell the property and leave. That's what we saw that we see that everywhere.
Yeah.
They're going to sell the property and they're going to get out of there. They don't have to face the negative effects of climate change in 20 years unless they themselves live there. It's all about the money at the end of the day.
Yeah. And so I'd like to walk it back just a little bit. When you talk about the sort of, in your study, Arunima, you referred to the misinformation susceptible public.
Mhm.
Is it just a type of confirmation bias? Like, what makes a group more open to believing disinformation?
That's a great question. So it's not just confirmation bias, right? So confirmation bias would be, I have this specific attitude,
Mhm.
and I'm only going to accept information that confirms my attitude. But it's not just that. It's also, am I motivated enough about the issue to actually pay attention to information that confirms my attitude? Have I previously come across information that is false or is verifiably false? I may not know that it's false, but that is verifiably false. So those three things together is what help us understand who falls into which of the four publics. So motivation, attitude, and past acceptance of misinformation. is what helps us classify people into one of those 4 groups and therefore target them more effectively.
Interesting. Okay. I think that makes a lot of sense. So yeah, I mean, I think you kind of have to know who you're corresponding with and who you're talking to, but that's sort of hard to do from necessarily, you know, like a one-off tweet or something. So how, you know, to all of you, what's sort of the benefit of engaging on a one-on-one level with these people who are spreading disinformation? Do you assume that everyone is a troll, or do you assume that some people are just misinformed?
I think there's a lot of evidence that's been coming out that it's really hard to persuade someone or talk to someone about these types of issues, and that often it needs to be done privately. You can't one-on-one. I mean, this isn't posting something on social media is rarely going to, you know, have these massive long-term effects on swaths of people. I think just as we've seen with vaccine misinformation and other types of science information, that often if you're aware of a family member, that uncle, that cousin, it might be helpful to reach out to them and just hear them out, talk to them, and over time, kind of ask them why they believe these things and where they're getting their information from. Yeah, it's there's not one single magic bullet.
Wouldn't it be nice if there were? I think that leads us really well into my next question, which was thus that climate was clearly the focus of this study, as well as native advertising. But how can native advertising, Reddit, tribalism, like they don't impact just climate misinformation? You know, can you guys give me some examples of other topics that you've seen and share, you know, what you've seen with climate, but on the other topics, and sort of why you think those are hot button issues for misinformation?
So I can share a couple examples that have leveraged native advertising. Not so much the tribalism, I don't think as much, but for instance, the tobacco industry. Philip Morris has been, you know, they wrote the playbook on misinforming people about the effects of their products, and they continue with that. This time, they're using native advertising to influence people's perceptions of their tobacco harm reduction efforts, is what they call it. Their e-cigarettes and vaping, and they've been purchasing a lot of native ads in news outlets to even label the science that's coming out suggesting it may not be so safe. They're labeling that as misinformation. So Philip Morris, Johnson & Johnson, when they had their baby powder that had asbestos in the talc, it was causing harm to people. They native advertising to try and influence people's perceptions of the safety of their personal care products. And Purdue Pharmaceuticals used native advertising in the wake of their opioid scandal to whitewash what they were doing, what their contribution was to the opioid epidemic.
So I think part of the real harm of these native ads, or the real danger of them, is that they're, you know, sheep in wolf's clothing of institutions that you already thought you could trust. What do these media institutions, like, is it right to do these sorts of native ad stories, even if it says by ExxonMobil
right
on the byline? Is that enough?
I think it's a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Did I swap that?
That's mixed metaphor. I understood you. Is it right? Well, it's unethical, and it actually violates a lot of the journalistic principles that have been in place for nearly a century, that have suddenly over the last decade or so become very malleable, where it used to be that you should not blur commercial content with editorial content. Now, well, the news industry is having a revenue shortfall, and many news outlets are turning to this format because it makes money, and a lot of times readers don't understand what they're seeing is commercial content, so they don't complain about it because they don't realize what they're seeing is not editorial.
Well, it's very similar to, you see, for op-eds, opinion pieces around newspapers everywhere. People will share them and they don't like the preview link, because of course we know on places like Twitter, Reddit, often no one is clicking and reading the whole article. They're reading the Twitter link where the headline, the preview, 1 or 2 sentences. And so it'll be a headline that seems really inflammatory or just full push disinformation on climate, on vax, what have you. And it doesn't say opinion.
Exactly. And that's the same thing with these native ads. If you share them, I've done research on this, half the time the disclosures do not appear in the social media post, which is a violation of the law. But it's not being enforced just because the FTC doesn't have the bandwidth to police this sort of thing.
Yeah.
And so we all, and so we're here. Here we are.
Yeah, here we are talking about it. Gotta raise awareness, let people know what's going on. I'm gonna move along and say, at the symposium last spring, you discussed your work, Benjamin Sovacool, director of BU's Institute for Global Sustainability, said that we have to create defenses against misinformation. For the group, what do you think those defenses are?
So we've spent some time talking about challenges of social media and the difficulties there. But we do think that it continues to be important to check information there on social media. Arunima and Michelle may know better than me, but our colleagues Emily Viraga and Letitia Bodie have an idea about the impact of not necessarily being corrected yourself, but seeing someone else being corrected on social media. So it can—
Oh, interesting.
The corrections can be impactful, and studies frequently find that corrections on social media matter. The effects are typically small, but they do make a difference in terms of improving people's ideas. So that is an important space to continue to correct the information on. Unfortunately, most of the social media platforms are going in the wrong direction on that. But Arunima can probably add more detail.
And I will just say that just today, Twitter was declared the most, let me find the exact language, was scored the lowest for climate misinformation, or rather highest for climate misinformation and curbing climate misinformation. So before, a couple of years ago, they used to have a policy about not allowing ads that went against the scientific consensus on climate. We don't know whether that is still in place or not. So I think systemically there have to be large scale changes to say, here's the science, which is complicated, and I understand it is extremely complicated, which is part of the problem as well, and that we're starting from this baseline that we believe the science, and then we enact policy either individually on different platforms or at the governmental level. Now, the governmental level, of course, then we get into issues with the First Amendment and all that, which my colleague, Professor Barton Carter, can talk about in much more detail than I can. And so those systemic changes are absolutely needed. But as Chris mentioned, at the individual level, there can be effective things that we can do. And so Michelle and I have a program of research on narrative corrections, on using narratives as means to correct misinformation messages that are posted on platforms like Facebook and on Twitter.
Could you give me an example?
Yeah, absolutely. So we did this study specifically in the context of the MMR vaccine. So if you can, as I'm sure you're aware, there is a great deal of misinformation that connects the MMR vaccine to autism. And a lot of that misinformation tends to spread in the form of these very powerful narratives that people will post on their Facebook saying, XYZ's child, my friend's child, was a happy 2-year-old boy. And one day they woke up, they got their MMR vaccine, and the next day the light died out of their eyes and they became autistic. So that's the kind of narrative that is very prevalent, very powerful on social media that you can't really do anything about. But what or the platform probably can't, as far as I know. What we can do as individuals is counter that story with another narrative, a narrative that we call a narrative counter, which, for example, could be, I understand your concern as a parent of XYZ number of children. However, I had my child vaccinated. They got their vaccination, nothing happened. We came home, nothing happened. 10 days later, nothing happened. I say nothing happened, but in the background, I know that my child was protected against a life-threatening disease like measles.
Yep.
And there's also, so that's what we call an uneventful vaccination event counter. There's another counter that we call a conversion counter. That basically is a story of a parent talking about how they used to be anti-vax, and then their child contracted one of these life-threatening diseases. And that really changed their minds, that really opened their eyes, and they went to their doctors to consult and get their opinion and change their minds and became a fervent warrior for vaccines. So that's the kind of story that that we're talking about here.
I think from a climate angle, like a very easy thing, we recently put solar panels on our house, but I look at, my bill, which is now not going to go up because my solar power does all my energy, versus somebody who's running, all electric energy and pays $800 a month in the summer because they have to run ACs. So I think even just something like that is just a very similar, but in the climate vein. All right, if it's okay with everybody, I'm going to switch over. We've got a bunch of very great audience questions. Oh, sorry, Michelle. Go ahead.
Emily, if I could add one more thing, building off
Absolutely.
of what Arunima was saying, a third leg, if you will, is to a strategy is media literacy, educating people, educating kids in schools, providing media literacy education through local libraries, just talking about what these strategies are to misinform people, how it works, making them aware of them. Evidence shows helps make people more resistant to these strategies down the road.
I think that's very good advice. Okay, so question from the audience. John Della Volpe is the director of polling at Harvard Kennedy School Institute of Politics, and he does a lot of work and polling with Gen Z. And according to his research, one of the top issues with Gen Z across the board is climate change. Did you see anything in your research that confirmed this, or did you guys not break, did you not break it out into segments for focus groups?
So we ran surveys, and we do have data from Gen Z, and we will be running comparisons to see how Gen Z plays out against the other generations, but absolutely, in terms of how that bell curve looks, it's very much, the misinformation acceptance skews very much towards boomer generations than the younger generations. I can tell you tell you anecdotally, I teach 600 odd undergrads right now, and whenever I ask them in class, how many of you care deeply about climate change, 80%, 90% of the hands do go up, and these are 18, 19, 20-year-olds, and they care deeply about climate change. But of course, we are in Boston, so I will say that
we're our own, our own skewed subsample.
Yes, we're a private school in Boston, so it is with that caveat. I will say that,
Do you think we would be better served to fight against mis or disinformation by focusing more on the ethics of the actual communicators, newspapers, TV, radio, podcasts, or to attack the problem from the consumer end, namely focusing on training the public to identify mis and disinformation and identifying native advertising?
I think it's all of the above. We need both or everything. I think dealing with the supply of disinformation is what we really need to be doing. But I think that's the hardest thing to do, because as Arunima pointed out, there's the whole freedom of speech issue, which, by the way, amplifying speech is not the same as freedom to say what you want. That's going to be hard. Legislators, I don't know if they're going to be able to come together to, I mean, I think many of our legislators, it's very important. It's just how they want to solve it is completely different for different sets of legislators.
Right. They agree it's an issue, but the solution to it is no one's coming together to solve that on the same footing. I don't.
Exactly.
And I also question whether they classify the same piece of
the same
information.
things as dis and misinformation. Correct. That's its own, its own flag.
But in the meantime, the media literacy is what we can be doing as well.
Related question. What policy options should we think about as a country to curb things like native advertising? It seems like this type of ad is a really dangerous loophole to tell lies to the public while getting to put a trusted brand name on it.
Yeah, so I think we need better funding of public media. We've been losing news outlets left and right. Especially there's many news deserts throughout the United States where there are just 1 or 0 news outlets, local news outlets in many counties. And there's also some seeming news outlets that really aren't local at all. They are what is referred to as pink slime outfits. It's an imitation. It's an imitation, like the imitation beef. It's an imitation, and the reporters are not in your town. They may not even be in the United States. Often there is a political slant to it, or surely some sort of special interest slant, or trying to put just commercialized information in front of you so that they can sell ads.
Yeah, even where I am here on Cape Cod, our main newspaper is now, it's no longer independent. It's run by Gannett and USA Today, which there's still some very good local news happening, but it doesn't, I don't think, have the independent, it is its own unit that it did when it was fully independently owned.
Yeah, so we need to be looking at strengthening our public media. We need to be looking at alternative business models for news outlets, low profit, no profit models. And I know that there is some legislation at the state level as well as federal level that's weaving its way through the system in terms of providing tax abatements or something for different types of news outlets, depending upon how many local communities they serve, how many employees they have that are actually in the local community, that sort of thing. So that needs to continue, and people need to be paying attention to these pieces of legislation.
Anything to add, Chris, Arunima? No? All right. How can social media or communications coordinators in departments that may not be focused on or do work specifically related to this respond to the spread of misinformation surrounding climate change?
Can you repeat that?
Yeah. How can social media or communications coordinators in departments that may not be focused on or do work related to this topic respond to the spread of misinformation surrounding the climate crisis? So not necessarily, native ads or just whether in their own life or if they are an official channel and they see misinformation and disinformation, how do you respond to it as, someone doing your work in social media communications?
I think what Chris had mentioned earlier, the observational corrections that some of our colleagues, Emily Braga and Letitia Bodie, have written about. Put a comment in there. Are you sure this is accurate? And if you have a link to an official source or a trustworthy source that you can add to the comment, that's the first step.
Yeah, I was the social media manager for a government climate agency for a while, and we obviously got, the same people who would come back and be trolls. And they did studies, as you guys mentioned, that unfortunately for the current social media manager, interacting with the misinformation does help. It might not help change that voice, that's the loudest, but the other people are going to see the responses from this official organization and be like, okay, they're not just letting this stand, they're here, they really can back it up. So, I agree. I think really interacting with people, and as tiring as that can be, is an important step in fighting dis and misinformation.
I'm also reminded of a really interesting case study, or I don't think it's been written up, but it would be a really interesting case study of Steakums. Steakums is the brand of sliced beef and chicken and meats and all that. So during the pandemic, their Twitter manager had a series of tweets that they were posting regularly on media literacy and science literacy. And it was fascinating, the amount of engagement that got. If you haven't read or you haven't heard about this, please go look it up. It's a really fascinating situation where the social media manager was really dissecting anti-COVID compliance arguments and talking about the importance of media literacy and engaging with people on media literacy and science literacy. It was really fascinating. And again, from a very non-serious, very from a source from which you would not expect this kind of content to come from. So it was really interesting. And I wonder if there is scope for brands to come together to help address this issue, organizations to come together in sort of a thunderclap type of moment. But
it could be a way too for brands to show that they're not just kind of greenwashing, like we care, but like, nope, here we are fighting misinformation on our own fronts. I think that's
and it does require a lot of it requires a lot of courage from brands too, because they don't want to become Bud Light.
Right. Yep. It's back to the partisanship that we were talking about earlier, which I think is really pervasive in everything, and especially when you're talking about these hot button issues. I have, I think, one last question from the audience, which is a person who is a journalist looking to pivot to climate change and environment and wants to become a, quote, information warrior in climate communications. Are there any organizations that do work to combat misinformation, and where should interesting persons look to make a difference?
Yes. So there is the International Fact-Checking Organization. So that is a global organization that verifies local fact-checking organizations in order for them to say that they are a signatory of the IFCN. They need to show what their practices are. So one of those organizations, fact-checking organizations, is called Climate Feedback. And they focus entirely on climate-related misinformation. In the United States, I think Climate Feedback might be headquartered in France, if I'm not mistaken, but they have people from all over the globe contributing. Based in the United States, of course, there's factcheck.org, there's politifact.com.
There's also a group called Climate Action Against Disinformation, specifically aimed at that. So they're the ones who came up with that scorecard I was mentioning earlier, where Twitter was the the worst in terms of climate misinformation. So they're, according to their website, they're a global coalition of over 50 leading climate and anti-disinformation organizations.
That's really great. All right, we're reaching the end. Is there anything that any of you wanted to talk about during this panel that we, sort of missed or we glossed over? Or one final, send off for our audience?
We're in this together, folks.
Well said. All right. And a final thank you to our panelists, Arunima, Michelle, and Chris. And of course, our audience. Thank you to everybody who asked questions. Goodbye.
Thank you, Emily.